Welcome to the first installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series for 2022. This series is a video companion to the MUD Proposal online journal, which is now currently in its 8th edition. The MUD is annually updated and features poets and projects that are international in scope and often multidisciplinary in focus. I'm Pat Clifford, a poet and social worker and producer of the series, and my co-editor Aryanil Mukherjee is here as our host and discussant. So we're joined in this installment by poet Forrest Gander. It's a little bio from your website. Born in the Mojave Desert in Barstow, California. He grew up in Virginia and spent significant years with the poet C.D. Wright in San Francisco, Dolores Hidalgo, Mexico, Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and Providence, Rhode Island. With C.D. Wright is a son, the artist Brecht Wright Gander. Forrest also holds degrees in both geology and English literature and lives now in Northern California with the artist Ashwini Bhatt. Gander's book, Be With, was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. And concerned with the way we are revised and translated in Encounters with the Foreign, his book, Core Samples from the World, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Gander has collaborated frequently with artists, including photographers, glass and ceramic artists, musicians, and much, much more. I'm very interested in learning more about that in our discussion after the reading. And Forrest is also the author of numerous books of poetry, including Red Start and Ecological Poetics and Science in Steepleflower. Gander also writes novels such as a Friend and The Trace, and essays, and is a very, very active translator. So welcome, Forrest.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah. I believe you're going to read from some of your work from Twice Alive and perhaps some others. So
okay.
Without further ado.
Well, I like that you call yourself a poet and a social worker. I think I'm sure those are partly discrete in your life, but they also seem like the same thing to me. It seems like poetry is a kind of social work, and that might come up in our talk about collaborations also. You know.
Yeah. I'm specifically a community practice social worker. So when you're engaging with communities, a lot of times it's opening yourself up to different ways of understanding, different types of knowledges. It's this key. I share that with my students all the time. So yeah, I view it as more integrated.
All right. So so shall I start a reading?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, before you do that, Forrest, let me just hold up the book cover for the audience to see from around the world. That's the book Forrest is going to read from.
New Directions has been working with these fantastic cover designers, and
sure.
Last two books have been designed by a man named Rodrigo Corral, whose work I really admire. Well, this book, Twice Alive, has a secondary title, which is An Ecology of Intimacies. And I'm interested in intimacy between humans and also between humans and non-humans. And this book is very much about both of those things. So the book starts with an author's note, which is probably worth my while to read a little condensed version of, because I'll be talking, those listening will hear a lot of scientific terms. I'm interested in the language of science and how it might be integrated into poetics. And also thematically, lichen is a kind of key element to the themes of this book. So my author's note: what many of us learned in high school about lichen, that it's an indicator species for pollution. Litmus, in fact, is derived from lichen, and that it's the synergistic alliance of a fungus and an algae or cyanobacteria is pretty much true, but it's simplified. Lichen ecology seems to have more to do with collaboration than with competition, and collaboration is transformative. With lichen, which may be more related some scientists think, to animals than plants. The original organisms are changed utterly in their compact. They cannot return to what they were before they joined. And according to Anne Pringle, one of the leading contemporary mycologists with whom I've had the lucky opportunity to collaborate, it may be that lichen do not, given sufficient nutrients, age. Anne and other contemporary biologists are saying that our sense of the inevitability of death may be determined by our mammalian orientation. Perhaps some forms of life have theoretical immortality. The thought of two things that merge, mutually altering each other, two things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of intimacy. Isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity, all identity, is combinatory? Twice alive. Mycobiont, just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life and a contested mutuality. Twice alive, algal cells swaddled in clusters. You take a three-lens jeweler's loupe to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichen, then the rock tripe lichen, then the irenic amanita mushroom swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony in drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum, and a wet thallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume, persistent on your skin when I touch your throat, so slow to evaporate, the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. But if herbivores eat wolf lichen, they die. And if carnivores eat it, they die writhing in pain, with the exception of mice. It is rarely possible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. The fuzz of fecal dust from lichenivorous mites triggers woodcutters' eczema, the bane of loggers knee-deep in sweet fern, sawing down cedar. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air, ghostly and damp, clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes, softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention unlinked to our own. So that series carries through the book. That's the first third of the poem, and the only part of that series that I'll read. But lichen keeps coming up. But the first poem in the book is an aubade, which is a poem of morning, a poem of dawn. And I'll read that now. This aubade is for my mother and for all of those we lost during the pandemic. Aubade. Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall. An understated what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices if they can be called voices, of towies, scratching in the garden, and then the creaky, low, husky voice flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a story, telling a dream slowly, as though in real time. And now, interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice? If it can be called a voice of absence, speaking intimately to you, directly, using the names of those who are vulnerable, those who are gone. I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment beyond your given life? Most of the next poems that I'll read are influenced by Indian poetry, in particular the poetry that came to be called Sangam. As probably most of you know, between 300 BCE and 300 CE, so 2,000 years ago, there was a blossoming of literature in southern India that came to be called Sangam, or convergence. One of the two styles of that poetry is called Akam. It's a poetry in which personal emotions, the nuances or of love, for instance, are linked with landscape in such a way that human feeling is inseparable from the place where that feeling takes place, so that the landscape in which we have feelings is acknowledged to be influential on those feelings that we have. The scholar poet A.K. Ramanujan translated and reintroduced much of that poetry, which we might consider now as a kind of proto-eco poetry. It's a phenomenological poetry in which human subjectivity merges with the world, with the landscape. Because California, where I live, shares the same 5 basic landscapes that appear in the Sangam poems. I've written poems that are influenced by the Sangam tradition, but relocated to California. I wanted to bring attention to that tradition to the audience of readers in the United States, because it's a beautiful body of work. So one of the 5 landscapes is wasteland, and this poem is called Wasteland, and it's for Santa Rosa, which is the town just next to mine. And it's a town that after I moved to California, that very summer, it burned with wildfires, which were caused by global warming and the ill care of electrical lines by our electrical industry. Lots of people died, lots of houses were burned up, and it happened again the next year. This is called Wasteland for Santa Rosa. Green spring grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July, gone woolly and brown, it crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it 20 feet away, tinkling. Across the valley on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise. One of the other landscapes is the sea, and this is a sea poem. It's called Sea Night Surfing in Bolinas. Bolinas is one of the most independent towns in the United States. It cut itself off from water supply so that no one could build a house who didn't already have water, and that's limited the number of houses there. They also famously, since the 60s, have cut down every sign on the highway that says this way to Bolinas, so that strangers don't find the town. It's also a famous surfing spot, and it's also famous for the sharks in its surfing spot. Sea, night surfing in Bolinas. Maybe enough light to score a wave, reflecting moonlight, sand reflecting moonlight, and you spotting from shore what you see only as silhouette against detonating bands of blue-white effervescence, when the crown of the falling swell explodes upward as the underwave blows through it, a flash of visibility quickly snuffed by night, the surf fizzling and churning, remaining itself to darkness with a violent stertor in competition with no other sounds. Paddling through dicey backwash, the break zone of waist-high northwest swell, as into a wall of obsidian, indistinguishable from night sky, diving under, paddling fast, and before I sit, one arm over my board, I duck and listen a moment underwater to the alien soundscape, not daytime's clicks and whines of ship engines and sonar, but a low spectrum hum, the acoustic signature of fish, squid, crustaceans rising en masse to feed at the surface. I feel an eerie peacefulness veined with fear. After 20 minutes, the eyes adjust behind the hand dragging through water, bioluminescent trails. Not enough light to spot boils or flaws in the nearing. Waves appear even larger, closing in fast. Then 5 short strokes into a dimensionless peeler, 2 S-shaped turns that kick out, and from shore, your shout. It is cowardice that turns my eyes from the now empty beach, for with you, I became aware of an exceptional chance. I don't believe in objective description, only this mess, experience, the perceived world, sometimes shared, in which life doesn't endure, only the void endures. But your vitality stirred it, leaving trails of excitation. I've risen from the bottom of myself to find I exist in you, exist in me. And against odds, I've known even rapture, rare event, which calls for but one witness. And this is another sea poem. And as we know, we're living in a time of the greatest mass human migration in our history as a species. And immigration is an issue in every country now. And I'm living in a relationship with an immigrant from India, Ashwini Bhatt. And I'm thinking also about the ocean as a constant immigrant to the shore, to every shore. Immigrant sea, aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts, brash crests of swell, spring grasses twirl, circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass positive, pollen negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. Another of the landscapes is mountains, and this is a mountain poem. This book is being translated into a few languages, and this has been the most difficult poem to translate because it's really an erotic poem, but the eros is sort of told through geology. In the mountains, Placer County, that's here in California. Whose blunt finger, its hornblende nail clipped, circles so lightly across the crevice knob, and her green delight of serpentine laughter as their tram swoops over the trunk valley. Car door slammed behind her. She faces the cirque in denim cutoffs, risen to her pudendum, and sees no gap in the pleasures nestled in his eyes watching, her eyes watching. Above the mission of his face, they swing like church bells, for mass always sways outward. A taste of jaggery and warm pennies. Oh no, in a wet groove, in a wet score grooved by glacial erratics. Where, he asks, as she initiates the uplift, and when did you learn to do that? Decamping downslope. A rattler riding its coil, her torso on her hips. She leaves chatter marks on a succession of moraines. Dark-paired suns, the orioles dilate as suction eddies whirligig along the melt stream. When the supplicant slowly bends, long thighs separate along the joint plane. No undertow of doubt, every part willing. The forest encroaches ashen earth when her knees begin to jerk. It's also somewhat based on the form of the ghazal. And I think this is the last poem. And there are a few poems in the collection called Unto Ourselves. And this is the first. Unto ourselves. Even when we realized we'd stopped, in every essential way stopped moving forward, when we came to see we were descending, even more tightly bound to the vortex as images rushed by in front of us, and a blue whale rotted on the sand in Bolinas, its stink drifting southward where dozens of barnacled 40-foot grays, dead from starvation, began to hulk against the shore, the white tufted foreheads of waves smashing against those knolls of oily decomposing flesh. It was everywhere we looked, if we cared to look, out over the bite-sized squares of cheese and Saintsbury wine, into the hum taking place under a coved moon, or cared to listen to clumped wild rye shushing the dunes, while pulverized rock shrieked along fault lines in decibels so muted only the soles of our feet, conducting the ground sound up into our tali, could register what was happening. Right there, where our lives had been, cut off from themselves and become something else, drained of substance, steeped in the privilege against which we protested with those we called our friends, the ones who lately seemed to contract backward from our greetings, giving us to suspect that they too sensed something askew, the skip at the center of ourselves, or just an inkling of abyssal unhappiness, was it, concentrated into the early evenings, like one of those spectral white deer introduced to the headlands that began to outcompete native species, and so, before they were slaughtered, every one by hired hunters, inciting arguments about what was native, if all systems are given to change. Maybe our ear itches, twitches, maybe the deer's ear twitches, but we still can't quite make out in the dimness what we're looking at, can we? Nor is there interim from the tumult of incoming, the masticating chores, ping-pings begging immediate response, the sheer overabundance of the present, shame, which plugs up each minute and stands in now for whatever it meant to live oneself, before every gesture became performance for an audience we imagine never to be finished with looking at us. And as for the budding out of being we called passion, or the sensual moments phrased into our gait when we were coming to feel something, when our shadows merged, not as romance, but the real consequence of our mutuality, with shadows of conifers along the steep ravine, and completely naked and without relief, the world parsed us into the inhuman, where roseate lichen surged across rocks, lacking nothing that might be needed to answer for our existence. By now, some of us, outmaneuvered by the economy, were lying around Dolores Park like fallen fruit waiting to rot. Others found themselves receptive to a trivial, self-justifying kindness. What with coral belching up its algae, the constellations receding, the awakened tundra, how could we bear, we wondered, to each other, even the weight of our own sorry initiatives? Life, someone countered, is pure, gratuitous magnitude. Just look, the light is there, grace itself. But it was already noon, and as we looked, the colors of the hills began to blanch, and all around us in the field of the visible, we sensed, without speaking, duration's ebb. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for such a powerful reading. I know as we begin our discussions, there's so many different, trailheads, to use a metaphor, that we could go with our discussion. But I believe Aryanil is going to start us off with the first question.
Yeah, I would like to thank you. Thank you, Forrest. Profound thanks for such a wonderful reading.
It's my gratefulness to, yeah, that you've made this forum for these terrific international poets. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for doing that, for your generosity.
You are most welcome. Several things going on in my head. I did make some notes. So first, a side comment. From the author's note, I could not resist the temptation of seizing this particular line towards the end, where you say, the thought of two things that merge, mutually altering each other, two things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of intimacy. Well, it brought me to think about collaborative poetry. My first question is,
I think that collaboration is, well, it's a model of social interaction that I really admire. And in biology, the old notion of evolution as just a competition has been replaced with our realization that so much of evolution is actually based on cooperation, on collaboration.
I write mathematical algorithms where I tend to very often use the concept of symbiosis, which can perhaps also be looked upon as a collaboration where one thing depends on the other.
Precisely. Mm-hmm. How does it, symbiosis in mathematics? Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Because I work with numerical mathematics and in the industry, where pure math doesn't quite solve all problems, but you have to write one algorithm that caters to numerous things. Let's say it's used to build the Mars rover, and someone uses the same algorithm to design a car. Another person uses the same algorithm to enhance an MRI scan. So the needs are somewhat different, and so that's why we have to sometimes bring in other algorithms and merge them into one.
Nice.
Role play each other. Anyway, my first question to you is, I understand that because of your interest in ecology and geology, you might have had, many other poems or books or series of poems on this topic that centers around ecology. But is this your first major book length project, especially in the area of mycology?
Well, the Australian poet and activist John Kinsella and I published a book called Red Start, an ecological poetics. And that book, which was a collaborative book, again, like you said, symbiotic book, was focused entirely on ecology and poetics and merged genres. There was poetry and there were essays and there were drawings in that book. So that was a full book. And the rest of my work has, almost all of my books have included poems about influenced by geology and interested in ecology, because I think it is we live in a time of so many crises, but the sort of overriding crises for our species and other species is what we've done to the environment. And that involves everyone, and everyone needs to be partly responsible, though the people that will suffer most from global warming are the poor and people of color, and the species that can't adapt in time. Mm-hmm. So it's a major crisis that I think lots of writers now are taking up, because scientists alone haven't been persuasive enough to sort of change the way we think about how we live in relation to the rest of the world.
And how did your collaboration with Anne Pringle begin? I'm a little curious. I would assume that you visited her sites of exploration and investigation together with her.
We did. There's a secret place
Okay.
in Wisconsin near the Great Lakes that I'm not allowed to talk about.
Sure, sure.
It's owned by like 50. It was bought in the early 19th century by 50 really wealthy families who are worried that industrialization, their own industrialization, that's how they'd gotten their wealth, was going to eliminate the hunting grounds that they wanted to keep. So they bought this big property, and by sheer luck, they asked this early ecologist, very influential ecologist, Aldo Leopold, to teach them how to take care of that land. And so it's one of the most well-preserved forests in the United States. And it's been opened up, not to the public, that's why it's still secret, but as a research center, because scientists can see really the past of the United States there in the species relationships. And that's where I went with Anne Pringle and her graduate students and some artists and a literary critic. And that's where I first became really attuned to mushrooms and lichen.
That's really interesting.
Recently, Anne, just like 2 weeks ago, she was on a research trip here in California, looking at a mushroom that's called the death cap. And again, I went out with her here and her brilliant graduate students. And it was a lot of fun. You know, I'd spent most of my childhood in the woods, and I was good at identifying reptiles and trees and plants. But it wasn't until she tuned my eye that I realized how much everywhere around us we can find lichen, which is on like 93% of the Earth's surface. And mushrooms are just everywhere when you become aware of them.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating. I do not remember having heard of any other poet who takes inspiration from ecological projects. I mean, science, a little math and physics. Yes, there are quite a few. One can think of Mike McClure, but
in the beginning of my book, I name I sort of call out maybe they put it at the end of my book, where I call out a number of international poets who have written about lichen, like Brenda Hillman in Sweden, Matt Solderland in Bolivia, Julio de la Vega. There's a number of them. Drew Milne in England.
It's really interesting. Just prior to your joining the session, Pat and I, with regards to lichens, we're also talking about tardigrades. So
yeah.
With all the environmental catastrophes, some look to this likely survivors, and
they will survive. Yeah,
they will survive.
Outlive us. Yeah.
So do tardigrades have a relationship with lichen?
I mean, lichen is already a relationship, and
exactly right.
Yeah. So I don't know how they're involved with each other, but in some way.
Yeah, it was just a wild guess. So Pat, I'll just pass it on to you. You had a question, you said.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for sharing your Obeid poem, and sorry for your loss. I actually also lost my sister during the pandemic. I know
Good, Pat. Wow.
it's been challenging. I mean, it's challenging to lose anyone at any time, but then with the circumstances of COVID, often like the rituals of loss are disoriented. The connections are difficult. So appreciate your sharing that. And it got me thinking about like
your sister in the hospital. Were you able to enter the hospital?
No, it was all virtual like this. It was all
The
via
same with
screen.
me and my mom. We looked in the window. We had to look in the window at her curled up in her bed, and it was just so painful not to be able to touch and to be there.
Right.
So
in fact, something came back to me when we met. We were talking to Cole and Pierre Alferi. I don't know if you're aware, Pierre also lost his mother the very first month of the pandemic.
No, I didn't know. Yeah.
Margaret Derrida, she passed away.
Yeah.
I mean, she was quite old. She was 87, I think. But nonetheless.
Well, yeah. And to me, it's like you're trying to, work towards a memorial for personal reasons, but also I think as a society, working towards like a public way of mourning or memorializing folks, because it's an organism that's affected the entire globe. So in a way, it's a kind of a global crisis along the lines of climate change as well. But in some senses, maybe a little more in your face. A little more, the waves are a little more immediate, but just the struggle with that. And I know that some of your work, I mean, that the work of kind of echo poetics of like listening to just not only different languages but different types of being, and then you're at Obeid, like you're almost listening to absence, like listening for that absence. I was really inspired by that, and I had, to me, wondering like, what can we, as artists, look to when we are looking towards like a collective memory or memorializing this pandemic in a way that can bring people together by a commonality instead of being like driven apart by it. Which crises can bring people together, but crises can also drive wedges in between. And so I see your work in the lineage of trying to like bridge and understand across difference. And so do you see anything hopeful either in your work or your collaborations with others in that regard?
Well, I think it's an important time for artists to be speaking. The thing you said at the like your first sentence, Pat, was about the rituals around death that are central to all humans and have been forever. I've heard an anthropologist say that the three things common to every culture that's been studied, every human culture that's been studied, are that we have rituals around death. We don't just let people die and walk over them. Yeah. That almost every human culture has some kinds of prohibitions against incest, and almost every culture has had some form of poetry, often connected to shamanism, to healing, to vision, and it's those people, us, who have been sort of responsible for articulating what our condition is. What is William Carlos? It's the voice of our time. Is always best told in poetry. It's the most intimate voice of a time.
Yeah. Yeah, so to me, I think it's interesting work individually and kind of in our reflections, but be interesting to see how collaboration. I know Aryanil mentioned like collaboration is key to a lot of the works we've been talking about. Is there a way that that could be sparked or encouraged, or in some ways there's models for that?
And I think those models are really needed at the old sort of early 20th century and 19th century romanticized version of the artist, of the writer in particular, was the lone genius in the garret, you know, writing with the frozen ink, you know,
Right.
and that, but like Cormac McCarthy says, books come from books, that we're always involved with others, and acknowledging that and letting go of that egocentric notion of what it means to make art, which is what happens in a collaboration. You have to give up control, and the exchange, what you get back are trajectories that you never would have thought of on your own. And that this might be a time when that model, the collaborative model, is most important.
Your website, I was looking at it in preparation for our conversation, and just there's so many different examples of kind of interdisciplinary collaborations that you have, not only the, you know, with kind of geologists or mycologists, but, you know, glassblowers, photographers, video artists. It's really, to me, it was really inspiring. Is there anything you're looking forward to in the coming months or year in terms of exciting collaborations on the horizon?
I'm doing a collaboration right now with, which has been very interesting for me. It's with a photographer named Jack Shear. He was Ellsworth Kelly's husband, and he has been photographing naked men with this big cloth. So sometimes you don't see their bodies, sometimes you do see their bodies, sometimes you only see like a hand sticking out of the glove, but writing towards the nude and towards the vulnerable, exposed human body has been a challenge for me. And it's been, I've been really excited by it, because again, it prodded me to do something I never would have written into myself alone. So that will come to be a book towards the end of this year.
That's interesting. Will it have both text and image?
It'll have text and image. There's going to be a really beautiful, expensive version that I can't afford. And then Copper Canyon will be publishing an affordable version.
Right. Good to hear. Looking forward to that. Very interesting.
Thanks, Pat.
I had a question, Forrest, about about the reception of this book, Twice Alive, especially the early poems on lichens. So how would you say, your audience around the world? I mean, let's break it up into the Americas versus the rest of the world. How have the audience kind of accepted or read these poems? I mean, I ask this question because, very rarely do you come across in a poetry that is so steeped in, profoundly steeped in a scientific exploration.
Yeah, so it's been interesting. I was able to publish those poems in more places in the US, the New Yorker and Harper's Magazine, and sort of very high-profile places were interested in those poems. And
that's really interesting.
And then the book, people have it's being translated in Polish and Italian and Spanish and Chinese. And I link that to the fact that almost every artistic and literary movement that we can name historically started in a city, a single city, usually by a group of men, often in Paris, right?
Yeah.
But eco-poetry started to happen at the time when the computer was available. And instead of starting in one city by a group of men, it started at the same time all over the world. One of the preeminent,
ecofeminists, one comes to think of.
Inger Christensen, a Danish writer, and then Julia Fyodorczyk, a Polish writer, Coral Bracho, a Mexican writer. And in fact, the three people I've named were women. And from the very beginning, it was international, an international interest, and it was equally sort of men and women for the first time in a literary movement that I can think of. So there's been a lot of interest around the world in this trajectory.
Right, right. Sort of a new millennium area for poetry.
Yeah, yes, it is. Not only for poetry, but for science and for philosophy, and you know, because our view of ourselves as superior to everything else, other species, and our view of the world as a transactional thing, that it's there to serve us, has led us to a monumental crisis, and we have to rethink those things.
Right. That's wonderful.
That's great.
Right.
We're running short on time. Is there any final questions, maybe, Aryanil, or final?
Yeah, well, I had a final question, but it's a rather tall one, so I'll skip it. I asked more or less the same question.
We can go as long as we want. We're
okay. So it's about translation, Forrest, and I asked more or less the same question to Cole. So my question is, do you think, I mean, you are a prolific translator and a wonderful translator, as I'm told by many, and I have some limited knowledge of Espanol, so I can figure out a few things myself. But the question is more about, do you think of poetry translation as sort of a textual mapping or transformation across cultures as opposed to across languages?
That's a really good question, Aryanil. I think of it less as a textual than a spiritual activity. I think it's the deepest, in a way, it's another form of what Pat, you're talking collaboration. You have to give up your own talents and your own voice to listen so intently to someone else's mind that you're able to hear the music in that mind. And then you have to come back with everything that you know to try to render that. And of course, the cultural aspects of that are profound. And it would have been impossible for me to translate, for instance, the Bolivian visionary poet Jaime Sáenz, which I translated with Kent Johnson, if I hadn't gone to Bolivia and to La Paz and picked up some of the vernacular there and walked the places where he walked. So I think, Nabokov, when he talks about translation, he makes so many rules that you have to know so much, the entire history of everything that person's culture went through, that it would be impossible to ever make a translation. But the more you know about another culture, the more your translation is going to be informed and respectful.
I do, as a translator myself, I do, especially in the United States, and I'm not from literature, but I have.
You're steeped in literature. You're always saying that, but you're a poet, Aryanil.
Well, I've had whatever exposure I've had to discussions about translations, and I've seen these discussions kind of narrow down to language and just language. And I think one of the main reasons is, most of the translation that happens here tend to go back and forth across the Atlantic. Where, so we are not really trying to translate across cultures that are very diverse or geographically so distant that there's hardly any familiarity, or how difficult it is to translate, let's say, Albanian into Indonesian, or Vietnamese into Serbo-Croatian. There is a poet I know who is working in those directions, and many would say, well, basically they don't have any clue. But I tend to think that the cultural challenges are far, far more, and language is only very secondary.
I'm with you there. If it was just language, then Google could probably do it. But it's not. There's a nice new Bengali translation of Navanitha Dev Sen in the US that reads really well. I don't know the original language, but I know the English is a really nice book.
You.
Like you guys, thank you so much for
Thank you very much, Forrest.
I hope we'll have the occasion to fall together in person sometime.
Sure. I really look forward to that.
Hiking, looking for lichens. That would be
very wonderful. We'll go lichen looking.
Lichen looking, yeah. Well, thank you, Forrest, for joining us. We'll wrap up now. Thank you all for the audience, people listening to this via recording. And we invite everyone back for our next installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series, where we'll be listening and conversing with Murat Nemet Najat.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.